And obviously it's not going to be quick. And the first few runs that they go out on, quite frankly, they may be looking over their shoulder.
It's going to be a long time before this department gets over this. I understand. And, you know, if they need us to come back and help out.
That's just some of the grief-stricken reaction to the latest senseless acts of gun violence. This past Monday in Webster, New York, just outside of Rochester, Christmas Eve. We saw once again what we have seen too many times here before. A crazed killer getting his hands on an all-too-powerful semi-automatic weapon and opening fire. And once again, we have to report the names of innocent victims, this time firefighters, who were lured to the scene, then intentionally targeted, and in a couple cases killed. Now, before we get to tonight's gun debates, I want to get the latest from Andrew on this story unfolding out of Webster, New York, which is up in western New York.
Yeah, it is, Rich. And the biggest question that's still unanswered about Monday's attack remains unanswered tonight. How did the killer, given his prison record and history of violence, get his hands on the weapons that turned a 911 call into an ambush? But as investigators search for those answers, we're learning more about the shooter and about another community coming to grips in the wake of gun violence.
Investigators continue to comb through what's left of this home that was the scene of an ambush attack set by this man, William Spregler. He killed 2 firefighters and injured 2 others. Today, news that a body has been found in the rubble of the Spengler home, possibly his sister, Cheryl Spengler, with whom neighbors say he had a strained relationship. Emotions are high as fellow firefighters face the grim reality of burying their own.
He intended to burn his neighborhood down and kill as many people as possible before stopping.
Police say Spregler fired from a nearby berm or hill as if he were a military sniper, using a tree as cover.
Spengler had armed himself heavily and immediately started firing upon first responders. Essentially, it was a combat condition.
He killed firefighters Thomas Kazawa and Lieutenant Michael Chipperina before shooting himself. At his side, a rambling, chilling typed note.
I still have to get ready to see how much of the neighborhood I can burn down and do what I like doing best, killing people.
His intent to kill is clear, though his motive is still a mystery. But we do know Spengler has a violent past. The 62-year-old served 17 years for killing his grandmother with a hammer.
All right, Andrew, thank you. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we've lost count of how many times we've had a report on mass shooting sprees like the kind in Webster, or obviously the case in Newtown. Newtown just 12 days ago, but look at what we have learned just in less than a span of 2 weeks. We heard from the president in Newtown pledging to push for sensible gun control laws and calling for a national conversation on the subject. After a week's delay, we heard from the NRA, opposed not only to any new laws to enhance gun safety, but shifting the blame to anything but guns, focusing on what else? Hollywood and video games, and also their call for armed guards in every school. We'll talk about that a little bit later in the program. And we're also hearing from the public about what voters think ought to happen. As we've mentioned on this program, there's generally a 4 to 5 week life cycle for coverage on any major stories, but certainly a tragedy like the scope that we saw in Newtown, and calls of action in the aftermath of that shooting to use that time ignoragnum in the best way possible. But we're already seeing signs that the public is forgetting the lessons learned at Sandy Hook Elementary. Take a look at these numbers. This from a Gallup USA Today poll asking if people want stricter gun laws. 58% say yes, but that doesn't mean the public overwhelmingly wants new gun laws. A little less than 50% here. 46% of the public say they prefer better enforcement of the gun laws already in the books, and 47% want the new gun laws. But the real surprise is when it comes to assault weapons. A majority of Americans, 51%, say they would oppose a new assault weapons ban, with just 44% of the public supporting it. And again, that's from USA Today Gallup. Now, how about new laws, and what new laws do the voters want to support? Well, there's near unanimity here that they're okay with background checks for purchases made at gun shows. And nearly 2/3 of Americans support a ban on extended ammo clips. And one more surprise from this poll. Even with that don't blame the gun response from the NRA, 52% of the American public still have a positive view of the gun group, and only 1/3 have an unfavorable view. Okay. it was interesting after what I thought was one of the most disastrous Dominic press conferences I've seen in recent memory, with Mr. LaPierre basically introducing America to a video game they never heard of and then blaming the media and the video games for all the violence and sounding, I thought, nonsensical out of this. I still think there's momentum to do something. I think this story touched people, but we know how fast people forget a story and want to move on to the next one. What do you think should and could happen if the president really wants to make good on the words here to change at least the dialogue, if not the laws in the books?
Well, first of all, we know that the president is going to wait for his commission, his group that's studying this issue, headed by Vice President Joe Biden, to come back. Once that's done, I think we're going to see some action. There has to be some action. I really believe in my heart, and I've been doing this for 25 years, that this time is different. Those 20 kids in Newtown, Connecticut, no one is going to forget that. And more, each incident is making it worse. You're going to see an assault weapons ban. Maybe I'm overly optimistic, but I don't think so. And we're going to see some type of ban on these high ammunition clips, at a minimum.
You know, the more, I'm not going to bore everybody with all the tangential connections, but the more and more you read, Richard, the more BS LaPierre was saying. For example, those video game manufacturers, okay, they're part and parcel with the gun industry. And when you go and actually play these games, they actually have links here to some of the major gun groups.
He wasn't talking to you, and he doesn't care what you think, and he has written off a certain segment of the American population, and his job politically is to motivate the people who are either inclined his way or at least not unfavorably disposed towards him.
Wait, let's finish though. But wasn't it pretty interesting, the deafening silence that came out of every elected Republican just about after that address?
Well, they're in the same position that we just discussed on the fiscal cliff. You've got a small minority or a large minority who have an absolutist view of the situation, be it taxes or guns, and they dictate the politics of the rest of the Republican conference. It's not just on these issues. Look at the treaty on the disabled.
So you're less optimistic you'll see an assault weapons ban?
You know, the good news is that if you call it gun control, you get majorities against it. If you call it banning a high capacity clip, you get a majority for it. It will be about who can define the debate, which is why the NRA had that press conference. They weren't interested in persuading people who don't agree with them.
Right.
They were interested in capturing the vocabulary and dynamic of the debate. Whether they did that or not, I don't know, but they weren't talking to you.
And there are a group of people who, and we talked about this on Monday on the show, who say, you know what, don't penalize me because other people misuse their guns or because guns fall into the wrong hands. Don't block me from having access to something just because other people can't handle it.
Well, let me ask you a related question, but I think in many ways it could be almost a good test sample. You saw the same story I did a few days ago in the Times where they followed, in Connecticut, there was a bill introduced in 2009 about microstamping, which would basically make, you'd have to have a fingerprint recognition on a gun to be able to use it, which would limit, one would think, thank you Richard for the phone, that it couldn't fall into, a kid couldn't use it or whatever else, or it wouldn't fall in the wrong hands. To that end, if that's reintroduced today with Colt, for example, being an employer, I think, of related about less than 1,000 jobs, but hundreds of jobs in the state, that, hey, you do this, we'll move to another gun-friendly state. You think Connecticut lawmakers, of all lawmakers, with Newtown fresh in mind, would support something like microstamping? Or do you think the power of the NRA and the gun industry is such that even with everything that's happening, weeks, if not months after it, they couldn't get that passed?
I think you might see something in Connecticut, obviously, because that's where the Newtown shooting happened. Also, you have Democratic majorities in the legislature and a Democratic governor, so I think it's a possibility. But what you're hearing from groups like Colt and threatening jobs if the laws don't go their way, that's really not very different from what we heard from a lot of big businesses in the run-up to the election in November, saying, you know, if Obama's reelected, we're going to have to lay off people, or we might have to freeze salaries, or whatever the case is. That's what they do. They threaten with the economic threats that they have available.
And I know we've got to hit a break, guys, but I just think where we are right now, basically blackmailing jobs here if they don't get the blanket, you know, protections, meaning the gun industry, or if people hold up appointing an ATF director or whatever else, It doesn't look, it doesn't sound right. I'm with you. It feels different this time because there were little kids.
It feels different to you. This is a debate in which almost 47% of the people are being written off by the 53%, and that is to say, they want to maintain their control over political primaries in the Republican Party.
Don't you think it matters how it's branded? Like you said,
I think
all of a sudden gun control is a lot different than limiting high capacity magazine
I don't
clips?
think it's over. I don't think it's not going to happen. I think Dominic may be right. But if you're trying to say what's wrong with those people, the part of the problem is those people are not in conversation with you or me, and there's a complete missing. There is no national conversation. If the president said anything useful, it's let's talk about it in ways that everybody, whatever your position, can understand.
Small steps.
Well,
small
let's
steps.
talk about, when we come back from the break, a newspaper right in our backyard that has made national headlines today by publishing a database of gun ownership complete with names and addresses. Is that public info that the public needs to know, or a paper gone too far and a violation, even in spirit at least, of people's rights? That's coming up next after this.